Well, thank you and good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, my name is Matt Masterson. I'm the Deputy Elections Administrator for the Ohio Secretary of State's office. For those of you who don't know, Ohio is a sleepy little state in the Midwest, not really very relevant in most elections. It's pretty quiet right now. I love this. I love this discussion, and I love the opportunity to be here, particularly as an elections administrator. I think a lot of times us as elections administrators tend to silo ourselves with each other, and then the other communities, whether it's activist community, cybersecurity community, does a little bit of that as well. And so I appreciate Verified Voting allowing me to come and talk about this. I'm not going to provide sexy Pac-Man video. I'm sorry. I'm just not going to have that. The part that sticks in my craw the most, being from Columbus, home of the Ohio State University, is the Michigan fight song at the end. That's a real burner. But what I hope to address for you and talk to you about is the position election officials are in this conversation, and sort of our reality as election administrators in this conversation. And as a point of reference, Ohio is not one of the places doing internet voting. It's not allowed by state law, and quite frankly, in a presidential election year would be absolutely crazy in the state of Ohio, because we're going to work with the systems we have now in order to go with what's comfortable. So I'm not here to advocate in favor or against internet voting, to be honest with you, which may be a little disappointing because it takes the fun. But as a lawyer, I'd be glad to argue. So my goal really is just to provide the perspective of the election official. I think it's a value. Both from a technology standpoint and from an administration standpoint, because the realities on the ground as elections administrators are a little bit different than sometimes, or than they used to be, I'd say. So I hope to give that history and a little bit of the technology, and I promise I probably won't even take the 10 minutes. I like the question and answer better. Anyway, it's more fun. First and foremost, I think to understand the internet voting conversation, you need to understand the history behind election technology and election administration. Prior to HAVA, there were some, although few, really paying attention to the nitty-gritty of election administration. It existed, there were some, but for the most part, election officials existed in anonymity. They were the office down the hall that the county commissioners cut their budget. That's what they were. Oh, elections only happen once a year. We can cut that back, or once every 2 years, which is, of course, not true, but that's kind of how it was viewed. And election administrators, for the most part, were logistical managers. They managed an enormous logistical challenge, whether it was on lever machines or punch cards, or even some OpScan or DREs that existed prior to 2000. That's what it was. It was a logistical challenge. Then, of course, 2000 happens, and we're all familiar with the incidents, and the Help America Vote Act is passed, and election administration changes dramatically. The election official is no more this, bureaucrat, nameless bureaucrat down the hall administering what is basically a large logistical process, but instead, the election administrator, and I just jotted down some notes, they're now a PR person. They're the front of the shop explaining the process, a process that is not easy to explain to the press. They are human resources directors. They not only manage the people in their office, but they've got poll workers, 400, 500 poll workers that they have to train, that they have to prepare, and these people, only do this once, twice a year, and so there's that challenge. They're trainers in that regard. They're now accountants, and not just in the money sense, but in fact with auditing. Auditing is now a reality for election officials, and that is a good thing. But that is a challenge that an election official prior to 2000, with limited exceptions, did not take on. And so that's a new role for the election administrator. They still have the logistical role, and in fact they are now complex IT system managers. And when I teach our election officials in Ohio about election technology, and we go through that, I love to throw up a slide of a typical elections office in the IT systems, because the amount of inputs and outputs in a typical elections office is enormous, and it's not just the votes coming in and the reports coming out. It's voter registration systems. It's managing poll worker lists for the purposes of jury duty. It's managing your payroll and your county offices and working with the county IT staff. So in that way, election officials are very much complex IT managers. And with that new reality setting in for elections officials, what's happening is they're moving away from being this nameless bureaucrat that manages, it's still a very complex logistical process, to being savvy IT managers. And that transition has been slow. I remember the number one phrase I heard when I got into this business was, "Oh, I'm just an elections official. I'm not a techie." Well, that's no longer okay, right? That's no longer what an election official can explain. There is an expectation now that an election official will understand the systems they have to manage. And with that has come a savvy with an election official. And it's not there yet, but it's getting better and better as it goes. And so with that savvy and with that conversation have come expectations, both from election officials, from county commissioners and county boards, from states, and from the public. And I think that's where this internet voting discussion comes in. The number one question that I'm asked, is when are we going to vote on the internet? And it's not just my friends, it's when I go to events, it's when I go talk to people, it's what I'm asked. Matt, when are we going to vote on the internet? And frankly, I say, I don't know. Some are, some aren't already. In the state of Ohio, we're not. But that's what people want to know. There is already that expectation. Like it, good, bad, indifferent, that expectation already exists out there in society. And it makes sense, I think, why that expectation exists. And it's not a fair one-to-one comparison, and I have a feeling we'll probably get into this discussion, and there's been some really good papers written about this. But when you do everything else online, and your comfort level online is that high, the expectation is you're going to do this online too. Whether that's right or wrong, and again, I'm not saying that's correct or incorrect, but when you can adopt a child online, or at least submit the paperwork to adopt a child online, when you could file your IRS paperwork online, and I'm intentionally staying away from the banking example because I think it's the most common one used, and it's a fair one, but I think the discussion's been had about that. I think there's a lot of other examples where people are conducting what are complex transactions. People can buy houses online without ever having seen the house. That's complex, and that's an intense process. And so that's the expectations that election officials are dealing with. On top of that, election officials are dealing with their county commissioners and with their county government. These are both a mixture of elected officials and just county workers. And the expectation from those elected officials is, look, I'm going to give you less, and I'm going to expect you to do more. And the natural transition for an election official who's now becoming more savvy in the IT world is to say, what processes can help me become more efficient to save that money and meet the demands of my county commissioners? Online voter registration is a direct answer to that from the election official's perspective. From the voter's perspective, there's that convenience again, that expectation of convenience. But online registration, money-wise, Maricopa County did a great study of their online registration. They went from 32 cents a registration to 8 cents a registration. Significant cost savings when you're talking millions of voters in Maricopa County, Arizona. And so as that transition in other realms of the elections office is taking place, the expectation begins to build, well, why aren't we doing this voting online? The other reality with that is, with the passage of HAVA in 2002, and the implementation of the new technology, that technology is old now. That technology is reaching the end of its life. You all have dealt with it, seen it, played with it, tampered with it, whatever, right? It's old, and it's hardware dependent, and it's interesting. I always joke about election officials' goals, and it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, is to be hardware independent, because hardware is expensive. Hardware costs election officials money. And so the internet is a natural thing to look at because it's hardware independent from that. They can grab COTS stuff, commercial off-the-shelf products, and begin to work with that. And there's challenges, and I understand the risks involved with that. But that's the intuition that's going on there when you're talking about budgetary challenges and a need to create a system. An election system, when they're not running elections, just sits in storage. It just stays. And county officials are saying, well, what are we doing with that? What's that warehouse that's costing me $100,000 a year to store 35,000 voting systems just sitting there? Why don't we just have iPads that then at the end of the election, once you've gone through your whole process, I can use for other means at the county level? And those are very real expectations that exist right now for election officials. Those aren't just examples. That's the kind of questions election officials are getting asked from their elected officials, from their administrators, from their county government, and so that's why they're looking at it. The other reality in this, and I don't know if you mentioned, Dr. Alderman, about the scenario for DC voting, but the very specific problem trying to be solved by DC and other election officials is the challenge for military and overseas voters. And I think it's important to keep this discussion in that realm for now, because it speaks to a very specific problem that election officials are attempting to deal with. I think most of us in this room are probably familiar, but military and overseas voters, based on statistics from the Election Assistance Commission, are unable to cast their ballots successfully at around the 60% rate, depending. And so it's in the election officials' DNA to want to find a way to help those people vote. It's in their DNA to get them a ballot and find a way to get that ballot back. That's what an election official wants to do. And so when the rubber meets the road and you're down to the last minute, if that means taking one back by email or developing a system that in an emergency or not in an emergency, it gets it back, that's the problem the election official is attempting to solve. And the challenge for the election official, as far as the risks, is, look, these people are already being disenfranchised. Think of it as a denial of service attack of sorts. They're already having the problem of not voting. If I have to take on additional risk, but it gets their ballot back to me, that may be a risk I'm willing to take. That may be a risk I want to go. So when we're talking about internet voting, for most election officials, it's very specific to this challenge of how to serve military and overseas voters. And that, I think, is a really important lens to view this through because of the unique challenges that getting ballots to and back from these voters. So I think that's just an important kind of caveat in that, and it's one that Congress has recognized in legislation, and we can talk about that. So I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.